I never thought my own son would look me in the eye and tell me I was embarrassing him. Not at a school play when he was 12. Not at his college graduation. But at his wedding rehearsal dinner, surrounded by 200 guests, he said those exact words. His fiancée stood beside him, arms crossed, waiting for me to leave. So I left. I walked out with my head high, my purse clutched tight, and my heart shattered into pieces so small I wasn't sure I'd ever find them all. What they didn't know was that I held every string attached to their perfect wedding. The venue, the flowers, the 7-tier cake, the designer dress hanging in her closet, the honeymoon to Bora Bora, all of it. Every single detail of their $150,000 dream wedding had been paid for by me, anonymously, through a wedding planner who had explicit instructions never to reveal my identity, and 48 hours before they were supposed to say I do, I pulled every single string. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 60 years old. I've been a widow for 12 years, and for most of my adult life, I believed that being a good mother meant sacrifice. It meant putting your child first, no matter what. It meant swallowing your pride, your needs, your own dreams, so that your child could have theirs. I was wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the night when everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my son crumbled to dust. It was a Friday evening in April. The rehearsal dinner was being held at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and waiters who refill your water glass before you realize it's empty. I had driven 2 hours to get there, left work early, spent an hour getting ready. I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention away from the bride. I'd learned early on that Madison, my future daughter-in-law, didn't appreciate anyone who might steal her spotlight. I should have seen the signs earlier. I should have recognized the pattern. But when you love someone unconditionally, you make excuses for things you shouldn't excuse. The restaurant was beautiful. String lights hung from the ceiling, soft music played in the background, and there were flowers everywhere. White roses and peonies, Madison's favorites. I'd mentioned once that I loved sunflowers, that they reminded me of my mother's garden. There wasn't a sunflower in sight. I arrived a few minutes early, hoping to see my son before the crowd gathered. David was my only child. I'd raised him alone after his father died of a heart attack when David was just 15. Those were hard years. I worked 2 jobs to keep him in his private school, to make sure he could still play hockey, to ensure that his father's death didn't rob him of his future. We'd always been close. Or at least, I thought we had been. David was standing near the bar when I walked in, his arm around Madison's waist. She saw me first. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around her eyes, a pressing of her lips into a thin line. She whispered something to David. He turned, saw me, and his smile wavered. I ignored the flutter of unease in my stomach and walked over, arms open for a hug. David hugged me back, but it was brief, perfunctory. Madison offered her cheek for an air kiss, the kind where your lips don't actually touch skin. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought I was imagining the coldness. The dinner progressed in stages. Appetizers arrived. Toasts were made. Madison's parents, who I'd met only twice before, barely acknowledged me. Her mother asked if I was sitting at the family table. I said I assumed so. She glanced at Madison with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It turned out I was not sitting at the family table. I was seated at a table near the back, with distant cousins I'd never met and one of David's childhood friends I vaguely recognized. When I asked David about it later, quietly, trying not to make a scene, he told me Madison had done the seating chart. He said it was her day, her choice. I bit my tongue and returned to my table. Dinner was served. Speeches were given. Madison's maid of honor told a story about how Madison always knew she'd marry someone ambitious, someone who would give her the life she deserved. The way she said it made it sound like David was an acquisition, not a partner. Then came my moment to speak. I'd prepared something small, something heartfelt. Just a few words about how proud I was of David, how I couldn't wait to welcome Madison into our family. I stood up, wineglass in hand, and started to speak. I got about 3 sentences in when Madison interrupted me. She stood up, her hand raised like a crossing guard stopping traffic. Her voice was loud enough that the entire room went silent. She said I was monopolizing the evening, that this was supposed to be about her and David, not about me reliving my glory days as a mother. She said it with a laugh, like it was a joke, but her eyes were sharp and cold. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system humming. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something. Waiting for him to defend me, to tell Madison that a mother toasting her son at his rehearsal dinner was perfectly normal. He looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. And then he spoke. He said maybe it would be better if I sat down. That Madison was right, that this was their night. Those words landed like a physical blow. I felt my face go hot, felt every eye in the room on me. Madison's mother was whispering to someone beside her. Madison's bridesmaids were smirking behind their hands. I sat down. I didn't finish my toast. I didn't drink my wine. I just sat there, staring at the centerpiece on the table, willing myself not to cry in front of 200 people. The dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Dessert was served. More toasts were made. I didn't hear any of them. My mind was spinning, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand what I'd done wrong. After dessert, people started mingling. I stayed at my table, hoping David would come over, hoping he'd apologize or explain. He didn't. He was busy laughing with Madison's family, posing for photos, playing the role of the perfect son-in-law to be. I decided to leave. I picked up my purse and made my way toward the exit. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one seemed to notice I was going, except Madison. She caught up with me near the coat check. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. She told me it was probably for the best that I was leaving, that I seemed tired, that maybe I shouldn't come to the wedding brunch the next morning either. She said it would be less stressful for everyone, especially me. I asked if David knew she was saying this. She said David agreed, that he'd been wanting to talk to me about it, but didn't want to hurt my feelings. She said she was doing me a favor being honest. Then she said the words I will never forget. She said I was embarrassing them, that I was trying too hard to be the center of attention, that at my age I should understand my role was to support from the background, not demand a spotlight. I stood there, coat halfway on, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, not shatter, just crack, like ice on a frozen lake, a thin line that would eventually split everything apart. I asked where David was. She said he was busy. I walked back into the restaurant anyway, found him near the bar. He looked guilty the moment he saw me. I asked if he agreed with Madison, if he really wanted me to step back. He didn't answer right away. He looked over at Madison, who was watching us from across the room. Then he looked back at me. He said maybe it would be better if I gave them some space. That Madison was stressed about the wedding, that I was making things harder by being so involved. I wasn't involved. I hadn't been involved in a single decision. I'd shown up when invited. I'd kept my opinions to myself. I'd done everything I was supposed to do. I told him that. He just shrugged and said Madison felt differently. That's when I realized something devastating. My son was choosing his fiancée's comfort over my dignity. He was standing there, at his rehearsal dinner, asking me to make myself smaller so his bride wouldn't be inconvenienced by my presence. I left without another word. I walked out of that restaurant, and I didn't look back. I cried the entire drive home. 2 hours of crying so hard I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road. By the time I reached my house, my eyes were swollen and my voice was hoarse. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, just staring at the house I'd bought after my husband died. The house I'd paid off early so I could afford David's college tuition. The house where I'd hosted every holiday, every birthday, every celebration for the past 12 years. And I thought about how I'd gotten here. David had met Madison 2 years earlier at a networking event for his company. She worked in marketing for a luxury brand. She was beautiful, polished, ambitious. I'd been thrilled when he introduced us. I thought she was exactly the kind of woman who would push him to be his best self. The first few months were fine. Madison was friendly, charming even. She complimented my cooking. She asked about my work. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But things started to shift after they got engaged. Suddenly, I was no longer included in wedding planning conversations. When I'd ask about dates or details, Madison would say everything was under control. When I'd offer to help, she'd say she had a professional team handling it. When I'd suggest ideas, she'd smile tightly and say she'd think about it. I told myself it was her wedding. She had every right to plan it however she wanted. Then came the smaller slights. The family photos where I was cropped out before they were posted online. The dinner invitations that somehow never made it to my inbox. The stories David would tell about their weekend plans. Plans I hadn't known about until after they'd happened. Madison started referring to David's childhood home as her house. She'd talk about redecorating, about knocking down walls, about turning my guest room into her office. When I'd remind her I still lived there, she'd laugh and say, of course, but they were thinking long-term, except I did not live there. I lived in my own house 2 hours away. She was talking about a house that didn't exist, a future where I'd somehow handed over my home to them without discussion. David never corrected her. I started to feel like I was disappearing, like I was becoming invisible in my own son's life. The wedding dress shopping was when I knew for certain something was wrong. Madison invited her mother, her sisters, her bridesmaids, even her future mother-in-law from David's father's side of the family, my late husband's mother, who I hadn't spoken to in years. She did not invite me. When I asked David about it, he said Madison wanted to keep the group small. I pointed out that 8 people wasn't small. He said Madison didn't think I'd be comfortable with that crowd. I wasn't comfortable with being excluded, but apparently that didn't matter. 6 months before the wedding, Madison started talking about money. Weddings were expensive, she said. She and David were paying for most of it themselves, she said. It was a lot of stress. I offered to contribute. She said that was sweet but unnecessary. Then 2 days later, she sent me a link to a registry for our contributions. The smallest item was $300. I bought 5 things off that registry. I never received a thank you note. The wedding planning continued without me. I'd hear about decisions after they'd been made. The venue had been booked. The invitations had been ordered. The menu had been finalized. Everything was decided in rooms I wasn't invited into. 3 months before the wedding, David told me they'd hired a wedding planner. Someone highly recommended, very exclusive. I asked if I could meet her. David said the planner preferred to work directly with the couple. That was fine, I told myself. I was being oversensitive. I was reading too much into things. But then came the moment that should have been my wake-up call. I was at David's apartment, dropping off some old family photos he'd asked for. Madison was there, on the phone with someone, pacing back and forth. She didn't realize I'd let myself in with the key David had given me. I heard her say my name. I stopped in the hallway, listening. She was talking about the wedding, about how she wished she could just elope, that having to deal with all these family obligations was exhausting. That she especially dreaded having David's mother there, making everything about herself. I stood there, frozen, as she described me as clingy, desperate for attention, unable to accept that David had moved on. She said David agreed, but was too nice to say anything. She said the worst part was that I'd probably cry during the ceremony and make it all about my grief over my dead husband. That I was one of those mothers who couldn't let go. I left the photos on the counter and walked out before she saw me. I didn't tell David what I'd heard. I told myself I'd misunderstood, that Madison was stressed. That wedding planning brought out the worst in people. I kept making excuses. 2 months before the wedding, I received my invitation in the mail. It was beautiful, heavy cardstock, gold lettering, elegant design. I opened it with trembling hands, eager to see my name in print, to feel included in this momentous occasion. The invitation was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Hayes, no +1. No guest, just me. Madison's aunt, who I'd met once, had been invited with a guest. David's college roommate had been invited with a guest, but I, his mother, was expected to come alone. When I asked David about it, he said seating was limited, that they were keeping it intimate. I pointed out that 200 people wasn't intimate. He said Madison had very specific ideas about the guest list. I asked if I could at least bring my sister, David's aunt, someone who'd helped raise him after his father died. David said he'd ask Madison. Madison said no. She said my sister wasn't close enough family to warrant an invitation. My sister, who'd paid for David's hockey equipment for 3 years when I couldn't afford it. Who'd driven him to practice twice a week. Who'd been there for every game, every recital, every graduation. Not close enough family. That's when I started to suspect this wasn't just wedding stress. This was deliberate. This was Madison systematically erasing me from my son's life, and David was letting her do it. 6 weeks before the wedding, they announced their honeymoon plans. 3 weeks in Bora Bora, staying at an exclusive resort, all-inclusive, the trip of a lifetime. Madison posted photos of the resort on social media. Overwater bungalows, private beaches, couples massages. She captioned it, "Counting down to paradise." I commented, "Congratulations. So happy for you both." She deleted my comment. When I mentioned it to David, he said Madison was trying to keep her social media private for the wedding. I pointed out that she had 3,000 followers and posted publicly. He said I was being oversensitive. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if I was imagining the coldness, the exclusion, the deliberate cruelty. Then came the rehearsal dinner. And I realized I wasn't imagining anything. Sitting in my car that night, replaying every moment, I felt something shift inside me. The crack widened. And through that crack, a cold clarity seeped in. I thought about the wedding planner David had mentioned, the exclusive, highly recommended one they'd hired. I thought about how Madison had been so secretive about every detail, how she'd kept me away from every decision, and I thought about something I hadn't told anyone. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call from a wedding planning company. They'd introduced themselves as Elegant Affairs, one of the premier wedding planning services in the state. They'd explained that they were putting together a luxury wedding for a young couple, and they were looking for anonymous sponsors. The concept was interesting. Wealthy individuals could sponsor a wedding anonymously, giving a couple the wedding of their dreams without the burden of debt. The sponsor would remain completely anonymous, and the couple would believe they'd won a contest or received a grant. It was essentially charity, wrapped in the guise of good fortune. The planner who called me had explained that they had a couple in mind who deserved such a gift. A hard-working young man and his ambitious fiancée who were trying to plan their dream wedding on a limited budget. The planner said she'd been moved by their story, their dedication to each other, their vision for their future. She quoted a number. $150,000. It was an astronomical sum, more than I'd spent on anything except my house. But the way she described the couple, their struggles, their dreams, it resonated with me. I'd struggled too. I knew what it was like to want something beautiful, but not be able to afford it. I asked for more details. She couldn't give me names, she said, because of privacy, but she could tell me this. The groom was an only child, raised by a single mother after his father passed away. He'd worked hard to build a successful career, and now he was marrying the love of his life. My heart stopped. I asked where they were located. She named my city. I asked when the wedding was. She named the date. David's date. I felt the blood drain from my face. I asked if she could confirm the groom's name. She hesitated. Then she said she really shouldn't. But she'd been so impressed by my interest, by my willingness to give such a generous gift. She said yes, the groom's name was David Hayes, my son. I sat on the phone in stunned silence. The planner continued talking, explaining the process, the anonymity agreement, the way the funds would be distributed. She said David and his fiancée believed they were receiving a grant from a wedding foundation. They had no idea there was an individual sponsor behind it. I asked why she'd called me. She said David had mentioned in one of their meetings that he wished his mother could see him get married in style, the way his father would have wanted. That he felt guilty about the expense, knowing how hard his mother had worked to raise him. The planner said she'd done some research, found my number, and decided to reach out. She thought maybe I'd want to give my son this gift. I asked if David knew she'd contacted me. She said absolutely not, and he never would unless I chose to reveal myself. I asked for time to think about it. She gave me 24 hours. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it would mean. $150,000 was more than I'd saved for my retirement. It was every penny I'd managed to put away after paying off my house, after putting David through college, after surviving on my own for 12 years. But it was my son's wedding. And if I could give him this, if I could give him the wedding of his dreams without the burden of debt, wouldn't that be the ultimate gift? I called the planner back the next morning and said yes, the money was transferred in stages. Deposits for the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the band, the dress, the honeymoon. Every time Madison posted about another beautiful detail falling into place, I knew I'd paid for it. David mentioned a few times how fortunate they'd been to receive the grant, how the foundation had covered everything, how they could start their marriage without the crushing weight of wedding debt. Madison never mentioned it to me. Not once. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd done this out of love, not recognition, that the joy of watching my son marry the woman he loved would be enough. But now, sitting in my car after being humiliated at his rehearsal dinner, after being told I was embarrassing them, after being asked to step back and make myself invisible, I realized something crucial. I had paid for this wedding. Every flower, every candle, every bite of food, every note of music, the dress Madison would wear, the honeymoon they would take, all of it came from my savings, from my sacrifice, from my unconditional love, and they had treated me like I was nothing. I walked into my house and went straight to my filing cabinet. I pulled out the folder labeled Wedding Documents. Inside were copies of every contract, every payment, every communication with Elegant Affairs. I'd kept meticulous records, not because I planned to hold it over anyone's head, but because that's what you do with large financial transactions. I read through the contracts. There, in clear language, was my right as the sponsoring party to cancel the arrangement at any time up to 48 hours before the event. Any cancellations would result in forfeited deposits, but the vendors would be released from their obligations. I looked at the calendar. The wedding was in 9 days. I sat at my kitchen table, documents spread out in front of me, and I thought about what this would mean. If I canceled, David and Madison would lose everything. The venue would be released. The caterers would be freed. The flowers wouldn't be delivered. The photographer would book another client. The band would take another gig. The dress Madison had posted about endlessly, the custom-made masterpiece that had cost $12,000, would be returned to the designer. The honeymoon reservation would be canceled. Everything would disappear, and they would have no legal recourse because they weren't the clients. They weren't the ones who'd signed the contracts. They were beneficiaries of a grant that was, in fact, a gift from me, a gift I had every right to revoke. I thought about calling David, about telling him what I'd done, about giving him a chance to apologize, to make things right. But I knew what would happen. He'd apologize, Madison would apologize, and then after the wedding, things would go right back to how they'd been. I'd be erased, invisible, the embarrassing mother who didn't know her place, or worse, they'd see me as trying to manipulate them, as holding the money over their heads, as being exactly the clingy, attention-seeking mother Madison had described on the phone that day. I made a decision. I would give them one more chance. Not a chance to apologize, because I knew they wouldn't, but a chance to show me, through their actions, that I mattered to them. The wedding was in 9 days. I would wait 1 week. If during that week David called to check on me, to make sure I was okay after the rehearsal dinner, to show even the smallest concern for my feelings, I would let the wedding proceed. If he didn't call, I would cancel everything. 7 days. That was all I was asking. 1 phone call, 1 text message, 1 small acknowledgement that his mother's feelings mattered. I put the documents back in the folder and tried to go about my life. Day 1 passed. No call, no text. Day 2 passed. Madison posted photos from her bachelorette party, champagne, matching robes, a caption about being surrounded by her real family. Day 3 passed. David posted about his bachelor party, golf, steaks, cigars. He tagged everyone who'd been there. His college friends, his co-workers, Madison's brother. He did not mention me. Day 4 passed. I saw photos of the wedding dress fitting. Madison and her mother and her sisters all smiling, champagne glasses raised. The caption said something about the women who made her who she is. Day 5 passed. I called David myself, hating that I was doing it, hating that I needed this reassurance. The call went to voicemail. I left a message asking how he was, saying I was thinking about him. He texted back 3 hours later, busy with wedding stuff, talk soon. Day 6 passed. No call. Day 7 passed. No call. On the morning of day 8, 48 hours before the wedding, I woke up and knew what I had to do. I called Elegant Affairs at 9 in the morning. The planner, whose name was Simone, answered on the second ring. I identified myself using the code name we'd established. I told her I needed to cancel the arrangement. There was a long silence. Then she asked if I was certain. She reminded me that deposits would be forfeited, that David and Madison would be left without a wedding. She asked if something had happened. I told her I was certain. I said I no longer wished to sponsor this wedding. She asked if I wanted her to inform David and Madison, or if I preferred to do it myself. I said she should inform them. That I would remain anonymous. She paused again, then said she understood. She asked if I wanted to provide a reason for the cancellation that she could pass along. I thought about that. I thought about telling David exactly why this was happening. About explaining that you can't treat your mother like garbage and still expect her to fund your dream wedding. But I didn't. I simply said to tell them the grant had been revoked due to circumstances beyond everyone's control. A bureaucratic error. A funding reallocation. Something vague and impersonal. Simone said she'd handle it immediately. She asked if I wanted updates on how David and Madison responded. I said no. I didn't want to know. I'd made my decision, and I needed to live with it without second-guessing myself. We ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table, phone in hand, and felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. It was done. An hour later, my phone rang. It was David. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times in the next 10 minutes. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. His voice was panicked, desperate. He said the wedding planner had called, that everything had been canceled, that the grant had been revoked, that they'd lost the venue, the caterers, the flowers, everything. He said they were trying to figure out what happened, that there had to be some mistake. He asked if I could help, if I could loan them money, if I had any savings they could borrow. He did not apologize for the rehearsal dinner. He did not ask how I was. He only wanted money. I deleted the voicemail. Madison called next. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail too. She was crying, hysterical. She said this was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, that her dream was ruined, that someone must have made a mistake. She did not mention me, except to say that maybe David should ask his mother for help, even though I was probably too old to have that kind of money. I deleted that voicemail too. The calls continued throughout the day. David, Madison, David's number again. Numbers I didn't recognize, probably Madison's family. I didn't answer any of them. That evening, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw David standing on my porch. His face was red and blotchy. He'd been crying. I opened the door. He practically fell into my arms, sobbing. He said everything was gone, that the wedding was in 2 days, and they had nothing, that Madison was devastated, that her parents were furious, that everyone was asking how this could have happened. He said they'd tried to salvage something, anything, but every vendor required deposits they couldn't afford. The venues that were available were terrible. The caterers who had openings served subpar food. They'd gone from a $150,000 dream wedding to nothing in a matter of hours. I held him while he cried, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just a vast, empty numbness. When he'd calmed down enough to speak, he asked if I could help them. He said he knew it was a lot to ask, but did I have any money saved? Anything at all? They didn't need much. Maybe enough for a small venue and some basic catering. They could have a simple wedding. It didn't have to be elaborate. I asked how much that would cost. He said probably $20,000. Maybe $25,000. I told him I didn't have that kind of money, that my savings were for my retirement. He looked at me with such desperation, such pleading, that for a moment I almost broke. Almost told him the truth. Almost explained that I'd been the one who'd paid for everything, that I'd canceled it because of how he'd treated me, but I didn't. Instead, I told him I was sorry, that I wished I could help, that maybe he and Madison could have a small ceremony, just immediate family, something intimate and meaningful. He said Madison would never agree to that she'd dreamed of this wedding her entire life, that it had to be perfect or it wasn't worth having. I asked if Madison had considered that maybe the wedding wasn't what mattered, that maybe what mattered was the marriage, the commitment, the love. He looked at me like I'd suggested they elope to Vegas. He said I didn't understand, that this wedding was important, that it was supposed to be the beginning of their perfect life together. I asked what made a life perfect. He didn't have an answer. He left an hour later, defeated and lost. He said he'd figure something out, that he had to, that Madison was counting on him. He didn't ask how I was doing, didn't acknowledge what had happened at the rehearsal dinner, didn't seem to remember that he'd asked me to make myself invisible. After he left, I sat in my living room and thought about the boy I'd raised. The sweet, thoughtful child who used to make me Mother's Day cards with crayons. The teenager who'd hugged me tight after his father's funeral and promised he'd take care of me. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw his mother as a resource, not a person, as a source of money or babysitting or emotional labor, but not as someone with feelings that mattered. I grieved that night. Not for the canceled wedding, but for the relationship I'd thought we had, for the illusion of closeness that had been shattered. The next day, the calls intensified. Madison's mother called, furious, demanding to know if I'd had anything to do with the cancellation. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. She accused me of sabotaging the wedding because I was jealous of Madison. I hung up on her. David's friend called, asking if I could talk some sense into him. He said David was talking about postponing the wedding indefinitely, that Madison was threatening to call everything off if they couldn't have the wedding she wanted. I said that was between David and Madison. Madison called again, this time calm, calculating. She said she knew this was hard for me, seeing David get married, starting his own family. She said she understood that I must be feeling left out. She offered a deal. If I could find a way to help them financially, she would make sure I was more involved going forward. She said we could even do mother-daughter activities, get to know each other better. It was the most transparent manipulation I'd ever witnessed. She was offering me a relationship with my son in exchange for money. I told her I couldn't help. She called me selfish and hung up. The day of the wedding that wasn't, I drove to the coast. I'd always loved the ocean, the way it stretched out endlessly, the way it made me feel both small and infinite at the same time. I walked along the beach and thought about what I'd done, about whether I'd made the right choice. Part of me felt guilty. I'd destroyed my son's wedding. I'd taken something he'd been looking forward to and crushed it. What kind of mother does that? But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger over the past week, felt something different. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, but a sense of dignity reclaimed. I had drawn a line. I had said, this is how much I will tolerate. I had chosen my own self-respect over my son's happiness. And maybe, just maybe, that was what a good mother should do sometimes. Not sacrifice endlessly, not disappear for the comfort of others, but stand up and say, I matter too. I stayed at the beach until sunset, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. I thought about my late husband, about what he would have said. He'd always told me I was too soft, too willing to let people take advantage of my kindness. Maybe he'd been right. When I got home, there was a car in my driveway. David's car. He was sitting on my porch steps, waiting. I almost turned around and drove away. But I didn't. I parked and got out and walked up to him. He looked terrible. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red and swollen. His clothes were wrinkled. He said Madison had left him, that she'd said she couldn't marry someone who couldn't give her the wedding she deserved, that she'd accused him of misleading her about his financial situation, that she'd called him worthless. He said she'd given the ring back that morning. I sat down next to him on the steps. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't point out that a woman who leaves you because the wedding gets canceled probably wasn't someone you should marry anyway. I just sat with him while he cried. After a long time, he said he didn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. 1 week ago, he'd had everything. A beautiful fiancé, a dream wedding, a perfect future. Now he had nothing. I thought about telling him then. About explaining that he'd had more than he knew. That he'd had a mother who loved him enough to pay for his entire wedding anonymously. That he'd had support and sacrifice and unconditional devotion. And he'd thrown it away by treating me like I was nothing. But I didn't tell him. Because in that moment, sitting on those porch steps with my broken son, I realized something. He needed to figure this out on his own. He needed to understand, without me explaining it, that relationships require reciprocity. That love isn't just about what you receive, but what you give. That treating people with cruelty and expecting them to keep supporting you doesn't work. I couldn't teach him that lesson by telling him. He had to learn it by living it. So I simply put my arm around him and held him while he grieved his lost future. We sat there until it got dark. Then I made him dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, the comfort food I'd made him as a child. He ate mechanically, not really tasting it. He asked if he could stay the night. I said yes. He slept in his old room, the one I'd kept exactly as he'd left it when he moved out. I heard him crying through the wall. In the morning, he came down to breakfast looking slightly more human. He said he needed to figure out what to do now, that he had to call all the guests, explain that the wedding was off, that he had to deal with Madison's family, who were furious with him. I asked if he'd heard from Madison. He said she'd blocked his number. He looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in months. He said he was sorry about the rehearsal dinner, that he shouldn't have let Madison talk to me like that he should have defended me. It was the first acknowledgement I'd received that something wrong had happened. I asked why he hadn't defended me, why he'd asked me to sit down instead of standing up for me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd been trying to keep the peace. That Madison had been so stressed about the wedding, and he'd thought if he just agreed with her, things would be easier. He said he'd been wrong. That he'd hurt me. That he understood if I didn't forgive him, I told him I loved him. That I would always love him, but that love didn't mean accepting disrespect. I told him that for the past 2 years, I'd felt invisible in his life. That I'd been excluded and dismissed and treated like an embarrassment. That I'd tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was being oversensitive, but it did matter. I told him that I'd raised him to be kind and thoughtful and compassionate. That I'd taught him to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. And that somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten those lessons. He cried again. He said he knew, that he'd been so focused on making Madison happy, on building his career, on creating the life he thought he was supposed to have, that he'd lost sight of what actually mattered. He said he wanted to do better. To be better. He asked if I would help him. I said yes, but I also said it would take time. That trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. That he needed to show me, through his actions, that my place in his life mattered. He promised he would. 3 weeks passed. David called every few days. We had actual conversations, not just quick updates. He asked about my life, my work, my feelings. He listened when I talked. He told me he'd broken things off with Madison permanently, that he'd realized the relationship had been toxic, that she'd been manipulating him, that he'd been so blinded by her charm that he'd missed all the red flags. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be, about the kind of relationships he wanted to have. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship. If I'd let him, I told him I wanted that too. One evening, about a month after the canceled wedding, David came over for dinner. We cooked together, the way we used to when he was younger. We laughed. We talked about his childhood, about memories of his father, about the life we'd built together after the loss. After dinner, we sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, watching the sunset. David said he'd learned something from losing Madison, that he'd learned the difference between people who loved you for what you could give them and people who loved you for who you were. He said he'd taken me for granted, that he'd assumed I would always be there, no matter how he treated me, that he'd been wrong. He said he was grateful the wedding had been canceled, even though it had been devastating at the time, because it had shown him who Madison really was before he'd legally bound himself to her. I nodded, sipping my wine, saying nothing. He said he'd been thinking about the grant that had been revoked, about how strange the timing had been, about how it had happened right after the rehearsal dinner. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with something like suspicion mixed with hope. He asked if I knew anything about it. I met his eyes and saw my son, really saw him, maybe for the first time in years. I saw the man he'd become, flawed and imperfect, but I also saw the boy he'd been, the one who'd promised to take care of me after his father died. I thought about telling him the truth, about explaining that I'd been the one who paid for everything, that I'd canceled it because of how I'd been treated, that the money he'd spent years trying to figure out how to earn back had come from my retirement savings. But I didn't tell him, because the truth wouldn't help anything now. It would only burden him with guilt or make him feel like he owed me something. And I didn't want him to be kind to me out of obligation or guilt. I wanted him to choose it because he valued me, so I simply smiled and said I didn't know anything about the grant, that sometimes things happened for reasons we couldn't understand, that maybe the canceled wedding was the universe's way of protecting him from a terrible mistake. He nodded slowly, still looking at me with that questioning expression. Then he said something that made my breath catch. He said he'd been going through his old things, packing up what was left at Madison's apartment. He'd found some paperwork from the wedding planner, Financial documents he'd never seen before. He said the documents had been confusing, but one thing had stood out. All the payments had come from something called a family legacy fund. And the fund's administrator contact information led back to our city, to a P.O. box he recognized, the P.O. box I'd used when I was settling his father's estate. He asked again if I knew anything about it. I looked at my son, at the hope and confusion and dawning realization in his eyes, and I made a choice. I told him the truth. I told him about the call from the wedding planner 3 months ago, about the opportunity to anonymously sponsor a wedding, about how I'd known it was his wedding from the details, about how I'd spent my entire retirement savings to give him the wedding of his dreams. I told him about sitting at the rehearsal dinner, being humiliated and dismissed, about coming home and making a decision, about giving him 7 days to call, to show me I mattered. I told him about canceling everything 48 hours before the wedding. I told him the truth about all of it. He sat very still, not speaking, his wineglass forgotten in his hand. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, horror, grief. Then he did something I didn't expect. He stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and was sick in my garden. When he came back, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. He asked how much. How much had I spent? I told him. $150,000. Everything I'd saved for my retirement. Everything I'd planned to use for my future. He asked why. Why I'd done it, I said, because I loved him. Because I'd wanted to give him something beautiful. Because I'd thought it would make him happy. He asked why I'd canceled it. I didn't answer right away. I thought about how to explain it in a way that would make sense. About how to articulate the moment when love requires you to stop giving and start demanding. Finally, I said this. I canceled it because you taught me that my love had no value to you. That I could sacrifice everything and it wouldn't matter because you'd already decided I was disposable. And I realized that I'd been teaching you the wrong lesson your entire life. I'd been teaching you that mothers exist to give without receiving, that my worth was measured by what I could provide. I canceled it because I needed you to understand that I'm not just a resource. I'm a person, and people deserve respect. David sat back down, slowly, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He said he didn't know what to say. That sorry seemed so inadequate. I told him sorry wasn't enough. That if he wanted to repair our relationship, he needed to show me, over time, that he understood what he'd done wrong. That he needed to rebuild trust through actions, not words. He asked if I would ever forgive him. I said I already had. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean going back to the way things were. It meant moving forward with new boundaries and new expectations. He asked what I wanted from him now. I said I wanted a son who saw me, who valued me, who understood that relationships require reciprocity, who would stand up for me when someone treated me poorly, even if that someone was the person he loved. I said I wanted him to become the man I'd raised him to be. He nodded and wiped his eyes. He said he would try, that he would spend the rest of his life trying. We sat together in the dark, not speaking, just existing in the same space. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was honest, and honesty, I'd learned, was worth more than $150,000. 6 months have passed since that conversation. David and I see each other regularly now. He comes over for dinner once a week. We talk on the phone every few days. He includes me in his life, not as an obligation, but as someone he genuinely wants to be around. He's been going to therapy to work through some of the issues that led him to Madison in the first place. He says he's learning about boundaries and self-worth and the difference between love and manipulation. He started dating again, but slowly. He's more careful now about the kind of person he lets into his life. Last month, he brought someone to dinner. Her name is Sarah. She's kind and smart, and she treated me like a person, not an obstacle. When David told a story about his childhood, she asked me follow-up questions. She seemed genuinely interested in my life. At the end of the evening, she thanked me for raising such a good man. She said she could tell he'd been loved. After they left, I cried, not from sadness, but from relief, from hope that maybe things really were getting better. David has asked several times about the money, about whether I want him to pay me back. I've told him no, that the money is gone, and trying to reclaim it would only create a sense of debt that would poison our relationship. What I want isn't financial repayment. It's for him to remember this lesson for the rest of his life, to never again take someone's love for granted, to understand that even the most generous spirit has limits. That's worth more than any amount of money. As for me, I'm rebuilding. My retirement savings are gone, so I'm working longer than I'd planned. But I'm okay with that. I have my health. I have my home. I have a relationship with my son that's based on honesty instead of illusions. And I have my self-respect. I have the knowledge that when I was pushed to my limit, I chose myself. I set a boundary. I said no. That's a power I never knew I had. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd let the wedding proceed. If I'd swallowed my hurt and attended that ceremony and watched my son marry a woman who despised me. If I'd spent the rest of my life being excluded and dismissed and treated like an embarrassment, the wedding would have been beautiful. Madison would have looked stunning. The photos would have been perfect, but the marriage would have been a disaster. And I would have lost my son completely. Instead, I lost $150,000. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained the knowledge that I matter, that my feelings have value, that loving someone doesn't mean erasing yourself. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The truth is complicated. I regret that it came to that. I regret that my son had to learn such a painful lesson. I regret that I had to make such a drastic choice. But I don't regret making the choice itself. Because sometimes love means letting things break so they can be rebuilt stronger. Sometimes it means stepping back and letting consequences teach lessons you can't teach with words. Sometimes it means choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to disappear. I'm 60 years old. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant endless sacrifice. That it meant putting your child's happiness above your own dignity. That it meant accepting whatever treatment you received, because that's what mothers do. I was wrong. Being a good mother also means teaching your child how to treat people. It means setting an example of self-respect. It means showing them that everyone, including you, deserves to be valued. And sometimes it means canceling a wedding.